We're just talking a little politics. It's our topic today for great failures in cybersecurity. Has some politics angle to it as well. We're going to talk about the RNC and the DNC breach. We'll find out some things that happened in real time. We're going to see if we can analyze what they were and how that may play out. Give us the audio start.
The Breach, the politics of cybersecurity. In this fifth and final episode, and with Election Day right around the corner, we look at how Democrats and Republicans have both been compromised through Power's cybersecurity protocols. One of the dominant stories of the 2016 election was the Democratic National Committee, or DNC, email hack. The initial attack occurred when an official at the DNC was enticed to click on a spear-phished spoofed email and disclosed his credentials. This, in turn, allowed the hackers to establish a presence and move around in the organization to compromise the email server and steal thousands of emails. The attack was attributed to two competing Russian intelligence outfits, resulting in a garden variety hack. The Republican National Committee, or RNC, had a less publicized but equally troublesome vulnerability. The RNC had contracted with a marketing firm to analyze voter data in order to develop campaign materials for the 2016 election cycle. The RNC had a large voter database and gave a copy of it to its marketing firm, who then spun up a cloud server for the database. However, the cloud server was misconfigured so that it was wide open to the world, and they proceeded to upload all of this sensitive voter information to it, making it pretty easy for an attacker to find and use as part of opposition research. How could both of these political groups have avoided these costly and compromising positions?
All right, a good question to start us off with here. Let me introduce our panel to you. I'm Roby Brock with Talk Business and Politics, joined by John Burgess and Daniel Weatherly with Mainstream Technologies, and Charles Weaver with MSP Alliance. Charles, Daniel, John, good to have all of you with us today. Let's begin with, these are two very, very different kind of cybersecurity failures here, so we've got a lot to talk about in terms of packing them in. Let's go to the RNC first. This was basically a third-party compliance compromise in some ways. Daniel, why don't you kind of give us a little bit more detail of what happened at the RNC and how they just basically didn't really follow some pretty simple protocol there.
Sure. So the, as mentioned in the that we just heard, they contracted out with a third-party vendor to analyze voter registration data, which included things like, what religion people are, their preferences, a lot of things used to profile these people. And they spun it up on a cloud-based database. So it's off on an Amazon S3 bucket is what they call it. And those buckets, when you set them up by default, have security on them so that only certain people can get into them. So someone had to have configured it intentionally or by mistake to allow public access to this data. So as long as you know what URL to type into your web browser, you could access these files. No password needed, no security whatsoever. So this was actually discovered by a research company called UpGuard. There's companies like this that do scans across the internet. They're called ethical hackers because they're looking for issues to share with the people who have the problem so they can fix it before the bad guys get to it. So they found this actually on June 12th. They notified the RNC about it, and 2 days later, they actually put security back on it. So the question is, how long had it been out there unsecured? How many people accessed that data and downloaded it without our knowledge? We really don't know. One thing that I found very interesting, though, is here in the last few weeks on the dark web, 200 million US registered voter database showed up for sale. Is it related? We don't know, but it very well could be. But we're talking 200 million voter records that were posted online for anybody to get if they just would find it.
Wow, interesting. John and Charles, I want to get your take on this. How commonplace is something like this, a third-party vendor working for a company or a firm or some sort of outfit and not having the protections that they need? Is this, I know this happens every day, but is it, widespread? Is it this something that there's a 80, 90% vulnerability on, or is it a much smaller percentage of companies that have this type of vulnerability?
Charles, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, John. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the unfortunate answer is it's probably pretty widespread. It's widespread enough that there is a whole business model around stealing this information, right? It's bigger than the global drug trade right now. So the theft of information, or just generally call it cybersecurity crime, is a massive global issue, and certainly something that all companies are threatened by it and could potentially be vulnerable to it.
Interesting, John?
Yeah, and I guess kind of generally the nature of this relationship, we call it BPO, or business process outsourcing, where you're turning over a business process to a vendor or to a third party because they have expertise in it. They're good at what you're paying them to do. This marketing firm that the RNC used was good at doing this kind of data research. People outsource to companies like Mainstream for their technology services. You might outsource payroll. A lot of people outsource their payroll. So this third-party relationship thing is a very common business strategy. The attackers know this, and if you look at some of the very public breaches, there is a history of the attackers going after these third parties as vectors to get into their eventual target. And speaking of target, the big breach, the credit card breach from Target stores, came about because someone compromised some credentials of one of Target's vendors. They're almost monthly you're hearing about a large breach, and many times the vector that the attackers used to get into the victim's systems came through a third party, because they understand that there are moving parts there. There's a natural kind of wedge that can be sometimes there's a doorway there. So it's a common business practice, and the attackers know that, and therefore they take advantage of it.
Daniel, you mentioned that after about 2 days, they discovered this, potential vulnerability, and they put some security protocols in place. Talk a little bit about what they did, and maybe all three of you talk about what could have been done earlier on to prevent this from happening. What should be some of the proper protocol?
Yeah, so originally, of course, it was wide open access. You don't need a username or password. So, the easy thing is you put password back on it. So at least there's some amount of security. But is a password enough for data like this? I would say no. You want to add multi-factor authentication to it. You might want to put some restrictions on it so that, if all of your users are in the United States, then only allow the United States IP addresses to get to that server. So you can secure it by networking, you can secure it with authentication and multi-factor. So those are types of things that you would put on this type of environment.
Charles, with the clients that you work with, how do you advise on the front end of doing some of the protocols that Daniel mentioned versus figuring it out on the back end when you've already been exposed?
Sure, it's great. Yeah, great question. I think we would phrase it in our parlance, and companies like Mainstream are eminently aware of this and practicing this, but it's the vendor management. It's the practice of, in the outsourcing concept that John alluded to before, all businesses do it, even service providers do it. But when it comes to the service provider like a Mainstream working with a customer, maybe it's the RNC or the DNC, it's anticipating what their business needs are, anticipating that the client is going to have those third-party vendors working with them, and then working with that customer. The customer can't outsource responsibility, right? The responsibility is ultimately with the RNC in this situation, and then we'll talk about the DNC later. But the RNC has responsibility of the vendor they choose, and they need to make sure and ask a series of questions related to what Daniel just said, right? Are you using strong passwords? Are you using multi-factor authentication? And a multitude of other things to make sure that that vendor is doing things to prevent this very type of incident from happening.
John, I'll give you the last word on this one, then we'll move to the DNC.
Yeah, and much like Charles said, you as the customer have to understand what you have that's of value to the attackers, and whatever you're doing internally to secure it, yourself. When you outsource that function, as Charles said, you don't delegate the responsibility or the liability associated with that data. So it's up to you as the customer to make sure that the vendor understands your requirements and understands them, acknowledges them, and agrees to follow them. And then you have to have some kind of periodic touch base to make sure that they are still following them 6 months, every year, however long the relationship lasts. You got to set those expectations early, and then you have to have some method for reviewing and providing governance over that relationship and what that vendor is doing for you.
Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Charles, let's go into a little bit more detail about what happened in the DNC security breach there. This was obviously very high profile, beyond what we talked about just in the audio preview that set this up. Tell me a little bit more in depth, and everybody that's paying attention to us today, what exactly happened in that DNC breach from your perspective?
I will do my best. Robbie, I prefaced my answer by saying that because there's some debate on some of the issues related to what happened with the DNC server. So I'll present what I believe my interpretation is based on the facts. So one thing we know, fact, the data got out of the DNC server, right? It showed up on WikiLeaks. That's a logical conclusion, a logical inference that it used to be on that server. We believe, and I think that that's proven, and then it ends up in the public domain. So something happened. The issue of how it happened is, I think, in contention, because while there was malware that we believe showed up on the DNC server, if you look at the special counsel's report, there is a suggestion that around 70 gigabytes of data had been exfiltrated. They attribute that to the Russians, to the Russian GRU unit specifically. But if you look at the testimony of the private cybersecurity firm, CrowdStrike, to Congress, and it was just recently declassified, multiple times they're saying, we can't conclusively say that it ever left or that it was exfiltrated. So I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist, but there's at least some debate as to what actually happened. There seems to be malware that was found on the server. Data, a large amount of the data left and became part of the public domain through WikiLeaks. And what happened in between, I don't know, but obviously something that wasn't designed by the DNC, right? They didn't want that to happen. So that's what we know.
All right, John, so this obviously was a high-profile case. It led to weeks and weeks of terrible headlines with the information that got rolled out through the press and to the public right here. This could have easily been a business that was compromised in this way and could have had the same types of exposure, terrible publicity. I mean, this could have happened in a way that could have financially ruined a potential company if there were some things in there of the same kind of magnitude. Let me speak to a little bit of what happened with this spear phishing campaign and its success, how often that happens in the business world and what the potential ramifications are for businesses.
Yeah, and spear phishing is the most common, phishing and spear phishing are the most common tactics that most cyber criminals use to try to achieve their ends. They know that humans are susceptible to emotion. They're susceptible to social engineering attacks. So in this case, that's what happened. If you look at it from a normal organization, Yeah, I mean, the probably the ramification there is loss of funds. That's usually what they're after is money, or it could have been to get to data that then they could either resell or leverage in some sort of blackmail, threaten its release in return for some payment or a concession or whatever. So the lesson here is that every business is targeted by phishing and spear phishing. All of us are constantly, we were talking before we went on the air, Roby, that you just encountered this right before the call. So every business needs to be diligent to this. Every business needs to make sure that their people are educated that these threats exist and how they are being targeted, and then how to recognize them and deal with them safely.
Yeah. By the way, I also this morning in my spam folder, I also had a ransomware request in there that I immediately deleted because I'm quite certain it was just some sort of spam email there by the way it was constructed. Daniel, so John touched on this a little bit, but did whoever it was that was successful hacking the DNC for this data, did they just have success because the employees were not really educated about the schemes and they just I've read some of the backstory on how people think that this kind of originated with, I think John Weaver may have been the chairman or had some sort of role in it. He was a high-ranking official there, and that they may have accessed it through his email there. Was it just simply an education? So do you think it could have been prevented if they were more aware of these potential attempts?
I actually do. Being aware that these are the types of ways that criminals try to get into your network is the first step. And being able to recognize when an email is not legitimate or questionable is to stop and think. Look over it carefully. If it wasn't expected, contact the person who sent it and see if it was really them that sent it, for example. The other is, hovering over links to make sure they're legitimate. Of course, as an IT admin, I want to have all these other tools in place which are going to protect in case the user does make a mistake, because we are human and humans do make mistakes. But it is ultimately going to start with the person being aware of what they're doing. And then also realizing that, okay, I don't have data on my laptop. So if I click a link and it installs something on my laptop, that's not as bad as getting to the server, right? Well, it's a step. What it does is it gives that criminal a foothold in your network where then they can start probing out behind your firewall and other protections to other machines and move laterally within your network. So it's just as important to protect servers as workstations. And of course, the user is the interface on the workstation. So yes, education, I think, is number one there.
Charles, I'm going to give you an opportunity to pitch your potential, your business to the DNC. What would you have done on the front end to protect and guard against this happening?
Well, I don't know which vendors they were using, but my advice would probably be similar to the advice to the RNC, which is you need to be aware of the threats facing you. That is, you need to know what, as John said, what's of value sitting inside your network in that digitized format. It's of value to somebody. Knowing who it is part of the game. Being adequately trained and educated, like Daniel said, and making sure that you have the appropriate security guarding it, because you can't expect to go through certainly a normal election season, but even non-election cycles, it's still, you got a lot of massive information in there that's important to somebody. Protect it, lock it down, and treat it like it's valuable, because if it's not valuable to you, it's valuable to somebody else.
We haven't seen a lot of that, at least similar type of situation in this election cycle. So maybe people did learn their lesson from 2016. John, I'm going to give you the last word on this, but without being too repetitive, just kind of what is your overall advice for someone in this situation like the DNC and the advice that you would give to be preventative on this?
Well, we've hit on this, I think, every episode this month about the need to develop a culture of security in your company. Everyone, all of our businesses are prepared to handle fires and floods and personal emergencies. we need to understand that these cyber threats are are just as bad as those threats from the 20th century. So we've got a new age of threats that everybody needs to acknowledge that we are facing and that we need to deal with. And, you know, a second layer of protection that I would advise, in addition to training your people, is we talk about multi-factor authentication all the time. And, you know, that's valuable because the attackers are targeting people like me, who are the leaders of the organization. They're targeting people like Daniel, who have the sensitive administration credentials. Well, the people like Daniel in the technical side, they understand the value of multi-factor authentication, and they understand that it's more valuable than the inconvenience of using it. A lot of times what we see is that the leadership of an organization has not embraced that. They don't take the threat seriously. They're not willing to be inconvenienced by this additional layer of security, and that leaves them wide open. You know, the people who have access to the most sensitive information in your organization are kind of have their head in the sand about the threat and their role in protecting against that threat. So again, I would just close out with, you know, adopt a culture of security and understand that these threats are real and they're existential, and that, you know, we can't ignore them anymore. We need to do something to address them.
All right, great advice and a great way to wrap up our 5-week series here. It's a dangerous world out there, people, so pay attention and put the proper protections in place to keep yourself from being one of our future episodes of great failures in cybersecurity. We don't want to have to tell your story unless it's a success story. Charles, Daniel, John, thank you both, or all three of you, so much for participating in today's webinar. And guys, it's been a great 5-week series here. I've learned a lot from it. I hope everybody that's been watching these has learned a lot as well. Good stuff. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for tuning in. And when next time we roll one of these out, we'll promote it. We hope you'll come back and join us. I'm Roby Brock. Thanks.